Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Sunoikis Digital Classics session. Today is the 7th session of the spring semester, and we'll be talking about epigraphic object encoding. I would like to welcome all of you watching live this broadcast, and to encourage you to drop a line saying where you're watching from, say hi. And for those of you who happen upon this lecture at a later point, I'd like to remind you that you can see the slides that we'll be presenting and the outline of the entire lecture, along with a lot of useful links that you would otherwise miss on the page of the Sunoikis Digital Classics initiative, which we have linked in the video description below, or we could also show, there we go. And today I am joined by Clara Maniero Azzolini and Gabriel Bodard. And this is what we'll be presenting during this session. First, we will, Clara will introduce epigraphy as a discipline and will lead us through its origin and development and its long history. Then we'll talk a little bit about what text encoding is and what we particularly mean by text encoding when we reference it in the context of epigraphy and EpiDoc. Then Gabby will show you how to do a text transcription using the formalism and standards of text encoding, that is EpiDoc. Then I will be showing you a little bit about object description and what you could do with that, just a little demo. And then Clara will show you and present vocabularies and Wikidata. We will conclude encode inscriptions in Visual Studio Code, and we'll show you the exercises that we have prepared for you, which will test what you have learned. And hopefully we'll have some time for discussion in the end, which is always the most valuable part of these lectures. And without further ado, I'd like to give the word to Clara, who can start by presenting herself shortly, which I omitted to do. And yeah, thank you, Anna, for being here.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Polina, for the introduction. So in this first part, I'm going to give a brief introduction about epigraphy. And since this is supposed to be just an introduction, be generic, and apologies for those who already know the basics of epigraphy. So epigraphy is actually a very broad discipline. It's usually defined as the study of inscriptions on any hard and potentially long-lasting material. I say potentially because epigraphy has to deal with the passing of time. And as time goes by, materials that once seemed durable may disappear simply. In this sense, epigraphy is a study of the many traces of writing preserved on stones, walls, wood, ceramics, from a jumble of letters called on a wall to a large marble slab inscribed with sacred law and so on. So wherever the written traces of a culture exist, there is epigraphy, and in any place and in any time period. For this reason, I'm not talking about simply a branch of history or archaeology, but about a discipline that is inherently interdisciplinary. So an epigraphist, and here we come to the role of the scholar, of the scholars. An epigraphist must take into account paleography, history, archaeology, prosopography, and yet sometimes a bit of geology as well. Other disciplines are certainly involved, of course. And for instance, imagine what if an inscription was seen like 500 years ago, carefully copied into a codex, and then vanished forever. In that case, the stone is gone, certainly, but the text survives. And to understand it, a good knowledge of manuscripts is needed. But be aware, among the genuine texts, of course, the the fake ones are waiting. Some really peculiar men in ancient times like to take fun of the contemporaries, scratching stones and pass them off as true inscriptions. So be careful of that. Should we distinguish between manufact and text? Well, when epigraphy first emerged as a discipline, these two dimensions were mostly treated as one, and the main focus was on the text itself. As the discipline has expanded and explored new perspectives, we have come to give equal attention to both aspects, because we now realize that the inscribed object can be just as meaningful as the words it carries. And yes, after all, words always needs to be contextualized. Would an election poster written on a wall have the same meaning if it appeared somewhere else? And similarly, could we say, would a sacred inscription convey the same message if it were written on a simple wooden support instead of on a precious marble? The material object itself can carry artistic, social, economic meanings, and for that reason, it must be investigated as carefully as a text. So when we speak about epigraphy as a modern discipline, so as a modern concept, with its methods, its analysis, its discoveries, and sometimes its mistakes, because failures also help to build a discipline. When we speak about that, we are referring to an approach that began about 200 years ago. And the people often called the fathers of epigraphy are some of the figures that I'm now displaying here. And of course, this was not the beginning of the act of reading inscriptions. That activity, we can tell, started essentially when inscriptions themselves began to exist. But for centuries, those were read, interpreted, and sometimes misinterpreted, of course, by later generations. But what makes these early scholars important is not simply that they read inscriptions, but the fact that they approached them with something new. I mean, a scientific method of studying those inscribed materials. And the great ambition was to create a corpus initially that would collect inscriptions from across the Greco-Roman world, a project that in many ways still continues today. And yes, epigraphy, as you can tell, is an effort of collecting, analyzing, comparing, but also traveling, climbing, dusting. You can easily find pictures of epigraphists trying to reach inscriptions high above the ground. However, part of the study of inscriptions has always taken shape in libraries and collections, and today, more than ever, it takes place among scholars through discussion. Not only discussions about how to interpret an inscription, but also how to describe it in such a way that others can easily find it when they are looking for it. In other words, we need to speak the same language, not a language in the literal sense, of course, but a shared system, a standard. And we need this when we talk about manufact, when we collect it, and when we digitize it to make it accessible to everyone. And here's an example of how things have changed since the late 19th century. So at first glance, one might say that the two purposes of these two records seem different. The one on your left focuses on providing a detailed analysis of the circumstances in which the inscription was collected, where it was located, and how the author read it. But the digital record on your right instead pays attention to every aspect of the artifact and of the text. It collects the information already present in earlier record, of course, but it goes beyond purely philological details. Another difference you may have noticed concerns the transcription of the text. On the left, we see a transcription in capital letters that attempts to reproduce the layout of the letters as they were carved. But on the right, we have a more interpretive transcription. Again, here the intention is different, and the digital record aims not only to omit any information, not even abbreviations that early records sometimes took for granted, like you see here, publi libertà. So that's this is not an information we can find in the previous record. And but as you can imagine, it was not easy to reach a point where every scholar agreed on how to transcribe a text. In 1932, in Leiden, a convention was published representing a standardized system of representation. according to this system, the transcriptions in epigraphic editions are meant to be interpretive, allowing the reader to understand how the editor has interpreted the inscription. For example, the expansion of abbreviations is indicated with round brackets, such as we saw before, publi liberta. This should not be confused with another common situation that you can see here, where because of accidental damage, an epigraphist encounters a gap in the stone and inserts the letters in square brackets, the letters that might restore the meaning of the word of the sentence. But losing letter because of a piece of rock broke off is not the same as having a word deliberately erased. And since this must be highlighted because the damnatio memoriae, or even simply the mistake of a confused song cutter, is full of meaning, then double square brackets, as you can see here, will be used. But if that clumsy, let me say, stone cutter decides to write something over the regia, we use angle brackets to sign on this information. And I say clumsy because epigraphy, after all, must also deal with a clumsy stone cutter, and sometimes we have to reconstruct what he meant to write. And if by chance we manage to understand what a stone cutter with rather limited grammar perhaps was trying to say, then we place our restoration between corner brackets, as you can see here. These are half square brackets, so to speak, because in this case, we are interacting with something that has effectively been lost. That is the meaning, and that we believe we can reconstruct. And these are the conventions that most of us agree. But as you can see in this example, we can see some of the main diacritical signs I just talked about. And as you can see, the letters are written in lowercase, first of all, while still preserving the line layout of the regional inscription. And then we have the abbreviation in the onomastic Enya Veneria Publi Liberta. Next, we have the representation of a nexus here. That is when two letters share at least one graphical element. Sorry, keeps changing. Okay, and then yes, here we have the letter no longer visible. So we underline a letter that some manuscripts before us might have transcribed, but perhaps this letter is no longer visible. So we mark it so that the reader can notice it with a underline in it. And then the higher letter here, as you can see in the picture, I'm not sure if you can see it clearly, but here the letter is higher than the rest of them. So we want to make it visible to the reader as well. So we put an accent to the last I. And this is all from me, and I will now turn the floor over to Polina, who will explain and how an edition needs to be standardized today.
Thank you, Anna Clara. So what you just presented is actually a wonderful example of text encoding, but in case it is our students' first encountering of the Leiden system and of epigraphic documents, it might be a little scary to look at it like that. So I have brought for you today an example of text encoding that we have seen in our everyday work, or will see a lot in our academic future, which is copy editing. And this is a more familiar practice of text encoding because when editors mark up a manuscript, whether it's going to be with these squiggly, incomprehensible marks or nice and neatly in a text editor like this, they add some sort of symbols and annotations that provide some sort of instructions about the text. Now, these instructions might indicate that something should be deleted, inserted, or moved. In other words, while preserving the original text that is there, they also give us information about how we should interpret that text. But they could also specify how the text should appear in a final printed version for any potential readers. For example, whether a word should be italicized, whether a new paragraph should begin, or whether a certain typographic format should be used to make things clear. Most importantly, these editorial marks do not replace the text itself, but they work with it. They add a layer of information about it, and so every edited page that contains editorial marks like this is a kind of a text encoding containing two kinds of information: the original text and the editorial markup. So editorial markup, copy editing, is using a system of symbols that represent some sort of information, and a lot of these symbols and marks are standardized through varying countries. Publisher and individual editors might actually have their own preferred approaches towards marking these things. So it is very important when we are thinking about how to encode a text that we would like to be used by people in different places to consider that standardization should be in the basis of that. And also, in both of these examples that I've given here on the page, the squiggly writings and the semi-automated copy editing in Word, what we see is something that is primarily designed to be interpreted by human readers rather than by machines. So in the context of digital text encoding, what we need to start with is something that is standardized, that is structured enough, and that is machine readable. And fortunately for any sort of texts and humanities linguistic documents, we have the text encoding initiative being such a standard for a very long time now. It's been around since the 80s and continually improving. It is the most commonly adopted international standard for encoding texts, and it uses extensible markup language that we refer to as XML from here on. It has special parts in its structure that are responsible for representing editorial decisions and textual features in a way which makes it modular. So different initiatives may choose to pick the parts which are relevant to their work. And also very standardized. So you could be pretty certain that if a project has adopted the TI standards, their data could be queried and used with some expectations being put in place. And it is highly customizable, as I mentioned, because of this modularity. So, whoops, one of its actually most customized subsets is EpiDoc, which is the standard for encoding epigraphic text that we'll be showing you today. So rather than coming up with some new standards for encoding inscriptions so that we can mimic printed edition into the digital environment, what EpiDoc is actually a collection of standardizations that already exist of the best practices for encoding epigraphic materials. So it is adapting the Leiden system distinctions, preserving the Leiden system distinctions, and also when it comes to corpus and database fields, it's making use of the existing standards that will be mentioned later in this presentation by Clara. It started off as something tailored for epigraphic materials, but it very quickly expanded to its neighboring disciplines with which it shares most of its requirements and desiderata. Papyrology, numismatics, sigillography, basically every ancient document or material containing text could be encoded with EpiDoc. And it is not limited to Latin and Ancient Greek, although this is where its origins were. It has expanded now to accommodate other scripts as well, like Cuneiform, Mayan, and Mycenaean. And it keeps on expanding with each iteration of the new guidelines and schema and template that are also some of the output of the EpiDoc community, which is a very active and collaborative community that I have usefully put here on this slide to remind you that everyone who uses EpiDoc in any capacity is actually part of the EpiDoc society. So if anything is not explicitly written in the guidelines or is not accommodated for in the schema and the template, the door is always open, and in fact, people are encouraged to bring their issues and their interesting finds in their inscriptions or other materials to be included in the EpiDoc realm. And we will talk a little bit about the visualization platform and converters in the end in relation to the exercises that you will hopefully try on your own. But here I have just a very quick reference of the timeline of EpiDoc, and I will not bore you with the details of its history, but I hope that this really shows you visually what a long and interconnected history EpiDoc has had. It didn't just appear out of nowhere one day, but it is really rooted deeply into the epigraphic realm with the Leiden system that is in its foundation. And it's already been launched at the start of the century with the manifesto of Professor Silvo Pancheras to have online, free, and unrestricted database of all surviving Greek and Latin epigraphical texts that are produced down to the end of antiquity. And the first version of the EpiDoc guidelines was published not long after. Very soon, pilot projects appeared that were EpiDoc native. They were making use and iteratively improving the guidelines and the schema. And the neighboring discipline that I think has benefited the most and also brought back the most currently to EpiDoc is the papyrological discipline with the creation of the papyri.info platform, which has various modules that allow you to search and browse, but also to edit texts using the Leiden system, but saving yourself from having to look at angle brackets, which are not that scary, as you will see in a minute. But again, to reiterate this is an ongoing development that EpiDoc is undergoing, and the community is very active. And we are actively organizing trainings and dissemination events, and the guidelines and schema are updated about every 6 months, I think, to hopefully improve and remove any bugs or any issues that might be present. So in the SunoikisIS page, you will find a link to the EpiDoc template that is going to look like this when you download it. This is impossibly tiny for you to read, but I just wanted to quickly show you that behind all of these indented square brackets, for now illegible for you things, there's actually a very clear and simple structure. These are the 3 main levels of encoding of the monument and its text that EpiDoc's template is providing. So we have in the TI header, this large chunk of the template, information about the repository, the physical description. This is something that I'll show you in more detail later in the presentation. And information about the history of the epigraphic monument, so its origin, find spots, and circumstances. We have also the opportunity to include images, which are always important in such digital editions. And we have the part that is responsible for the text transcription, which is what Gabby will show you now in more detail. So Gabby, over to you.
Thank you, Polly. Yeah, that's very cool. Actually, it was only looking at your timeline there that it occurred to me that although it feels like the TEI has been around forever, and EpiDoc is a relatively sort of new development and customization of the TEI was only 11 years old when EpiDoc first came along and started customizing it. So actually, for the 3/4 of TEI's existence, EpiDoc has been there as a younger sibling. So that slightly distorts my view of the world, that I hadn't seen it that way before. So thank you. Yeah, so I just will show briefly for the next few minutes a few examples of the ways in which EpiDoc uses TEI elements and other features to represent exactly the same things that we represent in a conventional epigraphic edition as regards the transcription of the text. I will give a couple of examples of places where EpiDoc is a little bit richer than Leiden and the potential benefits of that. And there's also one or two examples of where Leiden is a little bit richer than TEI was, and so EpiDoc has sort of further customized it to make it a little bit more granular. But the main point is that we have this sort of one-to-one relationship between the Leiden conventions, which Anna Clara has already showed us. This is a slightly different presentation of the Leiden conventions than we've seen so far. The main difference between them, apart from the fact that I'm showing slightly fewer features, is that if you were paying attention and you look closely, Anna Clara suggested that in Leiden, illegible letters should be presented as a plus sign for each letter that we can see it's there but not read it, which is correct. It's both correct in terms of the original use of Leiden in the 1930s. It's also correct in that is the way that Roman epigraphists and in particular Latin epigraphists still use it. However, Greek epigraphists and papyrologists use dots instead of those plus signs, dots outside of square brackets to represent the illegible characters, whereas dots as a sort of match for a parallel for the dots inside of square brackets to show missing letters, which is not different in the Roman epigraphy. That's the same. So there's small variations within the way the Leiden conventions are used, which is a point I will also come back to. So what we've basically done is we've taken some of these TEI elements that Polly's just mentioned, and we've made a one-to-one, mostly one-to-one relationship between the TEI element or element and attribute combination and the epigraphic concepts that the Leiden conventions represent. So when we're talking about supplied letters, as here restored letters that are lost from the stone, that are represented in square brackets because the editor has guessed or predicted they would have originally read, we sometimes call that bracketed text, but what we really mean is restored text. And we don't use square brackets anymore, so we're not using Leiden, but we're using the Leiden concept where we distinguish between text that was once on the stone but has now been lost from text that should have been on the stone, but the stone cutter made a mistake and forgot to write it. Right? Or text that was never on the stone and was never meant to be on the stone because it's an abbreviation. Everyone would have understood when they wrote Aug that what they meant was Augustus. and so they didn't need to. Those are three different, very different concepts. Two of those concepts are not distinguished in TEI. TEI just has one concept for text that is not in your original source, but you have restored there for whatever reason. So we use this reason attribute to distinguish between lost text and omitted text in EpiDoc. So a supplied element without a reason attribute is not allowed in EpiDoc. The reason attribute is there in TEI. It's not that we invented it. It's just that EpiDoc requires it in a way that TEI didn't. So I'm going to give a couple of concrete examples of this. So a couple of examples of things that are very straightforward. We have text that in Leiden is presented either with these hollow square brackets, or sometimes it's easier to type just 2 square brackets. So you've got a double square bracket, and this means that the text was erased in antiquity usually, and we can either read it or we can guess what is there. So we simply use the TEI element del, which means deleted. We specify rend equals erasure only because you can also erase text by marking that you want it to be omitted, right? So you can underline text, or in manuscripts people will often put a dots underneath the letters. It's the equivalent of drawing a strike-through line through a text in a modern manuscript, where you're not erasing the text. It's still completely legible, but the strike-through just makes it clear that you're meant to ignore it. But so where it's been fully erased, even if incompletely, it's clear the intention was to fully erase it. We use del rend equals erasure, and that's what the square brackets represent. The double square brackets represent in Leiden. Another example is where in Leiden, if there are characters written on the stone that we think, if you'd pointed them out to the stone cutter would have said, "Oh yeah, I didn't mean to put that there," and it was written in error. This is most often ditography, where a character is written twice, sometimes at the end of one line and again at the beginning of the next, or otherwise. We present those in Leiden in curly braces, and there's the TEI element surplus, which means superfluous. I think the name of that element was developed via the use of a thesaurus rather than because surplus was a more efficient name for it than superfluous. A slightly different use is where in Leiden, the dots under each letter, unrelated to what I just talked about, dots under the letters in manuscripts, that was a confusing example for me to mention a minute ago. When we put a dot under the letter, what that means is those letters are damaged or otherwise unclear. And actually, if those letters were in isolation without any context, we couldn't be 100% unambiguous as to what letter that is. So even if we're absolutely sure what letter it is because of its context in the middle of a word, it can only be one thing. If it wouldn't be unambiguous outside of the context, we print in Leiden with dots under those letters, and in EpiDoc we use the TEI element unclear to represent that. We have one underdot per letter in Leiden, but we have one unclear per span rather than one per letter in EpiDoc. It's also worth noting that unclear means something very slightly different in EpiDoc. It means something slightly more concrete in EpiDoc than in TEI, where unclear can also mean, that this is unclear because we don't fully understand it. Unclear in EpiDoc specifically means damaged and therefore ambiguous outside of their context. Another example where we can't just replace the brackets in Leiden with the elements from TEI is where we have a lacuna. We have some characters lost from the stone, and we know what some of those letters are, but not all of them. So in this case, we've got a span of Greek. It says kataskeo, and then the stone breaks, and we think that word must have been kataskeoas there, but there was more on the stone. We can guess the rest of that word, but we can't guess the next word. In TEI, that's two different things. One is supplement, and the other is observation of a lacuna, of a gap. And so those are two separate brackets, two separate tags in TEI, and therefore in EpiDoc, where there's only one set of brackets in the Leiden convention. So that's a case where things have to be sort of split into two. They're not a simple one-to-one replacement of bracket to XML element. What we have to do in effect is imagine that the restoration in square brackets and the lacuna in square brackets are two separate spans of square brackets, and we put in these imaginary square brackets in there, and then we do the Leiden to TEI substitution. And those square brackets in the middle obviously will never appear in the actual text, but that's sort of what we're doing. We're imagining they're there, and then we're marking it up accordingly. This is the case that I was talking about when we were looking at Leiden. If characters have been lost and the editor is restoring what probably went there before the damage, then we say supplied reason lost. If characters have been omitted in error by the stonecutter and the editor is adding them, we say supplied reason omitted. So for this reason, EpiDoc doesn't allow supplied without a reason attribute, whereas TEI does. So EpiDoc has a slightly different content model as a result of the slightly different sort of way of thinking about text that we inherit from the Leiden conventions. There are other cases where Leiden says things like, you know, in parentheses it supplies a word, and this is not that this word was originally on the stone and has been lost, nor is it a word that was missing from the stone because the stonecutter made an error. It's a word that the stonecutter was perfectly comfortable leaving off the stone because everyone would know what was meant there. And we again use the supplied element with another reason attribute. So there's various different values we can give to the reason attribute that that subdivide the TEI element to mirror the richness of Leiden, which is richer in these capacities than the TEI element supplied alone would be. So turning this around, cases where the TEI and therefore the EpiDoc has more expressiveness than the Leiden conventions do. In Leiden, originally in the 1930s and still as used by Greek epigraphers, these angle brackets, which are similar to the brackets used in XML tags, confusingly, or in Latin epigraphy now, and I think in papyrology as well, the half square brackets, the upper half square brackets, are used when the stonecutter or the scribe wrote one thing and the editor corrects that to something else. Quite often that's letters written in the wrong order, but sometimes it's just a different letter that was written, sometimes for dialect reasons or just in error. What we're saying there is that the scribe wrote one thing, and so in TEI we can say seek, this is what is on the stone, and we correct that to another thing. So we can say core is another thing. We tend not to do that in Leiden. In theory, one could. There are variants of Leiden that do that, but 90% of people editing inscriptions wouldn't do that in Leiden. And what we see instead is just the corrected version in the square bracket, the angle brackets or the half square brackets, and you know, we might say what the original reading is in the apparatus, or we might not. As a result, if we don't know what was originally written on the stone, if we're marking up in EpiDoc a Leiden edition that doesn't tell us what the correction is a correction from, we can omit the seek part, right? Because while EpiDoc can be more expressive than Leiden, sometimes we can't be that expressive if all we have is the example that Clara gave of, we have an earlier editor has given us a transcription of this inscription, but we don't have the stone. We may not know what wasn't in the Leiden, right? So we can omit the things that are not there. Similar, I won't go into detail. This is an example where a stone was some letters were cut in antiquity, and then later, or it may have been later the same day, or it may have been centuries later, someone corrected that, so removed the original text and replaced a new one. Again, there's one set of brackets in Leiden. We can use these sort of nested side-by-side texts in TEI. But if we don't know what the erased part was, we can leave that bit out, because we can only be as rich as the Leiden is, if the Leiden is the only thing we have to base our addition on. The last example of when something is more expressive in TEI is the example of a number. We can tell that this is a number because in Leiden we've put this little number prime mark after the letters. This is not the word ra, this is the number 101 because that little prime character or karaya tells us so. In TEI we can just use the num element, which means this is a number, a numeral, or we can add a value attribute, which is not there in the Leiden, but it's a little bit more information that we can put in the EpiDoc. We don't have to, but we can do. That's handy. So the final note. EpiDoc has to, by definition, be able to make all of the distinctions that Leiden makes. In some cases, it may make more distinctions than Leiden makes, but you must also be able to retain the ambiguity that Leiden has, because sometimes we don't have any more information than Leiden. And the point that we started with, and that Polina also made, is that the EpiDoc is using the intellectual categories of Leiden rather than the specific sigla and formats of Leiden. And that's important because different communities may use different Leiden or Leiden-like conventions, but they can use the same EpiDoc to represent the same intellectual categories, and then they just choose to render it in a slightly different way. So I think that's my final slide. And I think I'm handing back over to Polly.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Gabi, for this illustration of how we can encode and what things we could encode in the text. My task now is to demonstrate what things we could encode in the object description and how we could use the EpiDoc tags to express different kind of information there.
We're no longer seeing your screen, Polly.
That is odd, but you will in a second. Sorry. There we go. Right. So I'll bring you back to the EpiDoc template in hopes to make it a bit less intimidating when you have to be with it on your own, but also to demonstrate that everything that Gabi talked about is contained inside this part of the template. And now what I will be discussing is here contained in the TEI header, where the description of the monument is. And today we'll be talking about the object description, which is in this particular little section. Now, I would like to say at this point, and we'll probably repeat it a few more times while I'm presenting, that you don't need to remember these things by heart. So don't feel scared and intimidated by all of this. We have the EpiDoc guidelines that are very nicely organized so that you can search them by feature that you want to encode, by a particular element that you're seeing and you don't know what it does. So this is just for demonstration of how things are organized, how they function together, how the different pieces sort of work. So yeah, the physical description of the object is contained here within the aptly named phys_desk element, where actually we have three things that we can describe when we talked about an object description. We have some information about the actual support of the, let's say, epigraphic monument that we are encoding, such as what type of monument this is, what condition it is in, the material from which it is made, and different information about dimensions and decoration that we might want to include in our edition. Then we have information about the text field, which is what the layout of the text is, what the execution is, whether it is inscribed or graffitied. And then we have proper description of the actual letters, so their dimensions and what their forms might be in case this is relevant for our edition. And what types of abbreviation marks and ligatures and symbols are used there, because this could also give us a lot of information for the object that is being investigated. So let's talk first about the description of the support. I have put here a little excerpt of the code that reads just like normal text. This is just a paragraph that you can read in a paper edition of epigraphic monument. This is a part of a marble stele cut down for use and so forth. But there are salient bits of information here that would be very useful if they could be made machine readable, indexable, and accessible to people that might be interested in different typological information. So here we could, for example, further enrich our annotation with an element saying that this is the part of the text that discusses the material of the object. We can say that the type of the object is a stele. We could further enrich this annotation by making use of an authority list where we have actually listed all of the different materials and objects that appear in our collection of texts. We could add information about the dimensions of this object, and there are several ways to do that. We could have this as nested elements. First indicate that we'll be talking about dimensions and then give the different dimensions individually. Or if we have different kinds of dimensions that appear on our object, for example, if we have a column, we might be interested in its diameter, in which case there are existing elements that can be used for that. We could also be interested in the precision of these measurements, in case this is something relevant for our research, or if the dimensions vary due to breakage or just the execution of the monument itself, then we can give a minimum and a maximum range for the dimensions. Further, we can say something about the decoration. This is a topic that might interest us. We might want to group our monuments by type of decoration. Oops. But all of this information is available, but it's not something that might be necessary for everybody. So the depth of encoding the description here and also in the text that Gabby showed us previously really is something that needs to be decided by the project doing that. You can continue further detailing this little paragraph for as much as you're interested, or leave it as superficial as suits your needs. It could just remain a paragraph. And then about the text field description, we could also give information about the method of placing the text on the monument. In this case, we have another authority list that is listing the various types of execution that are attested in our database, and we have a key that refers back to this list. Oops. And about the description of the letters, again, there are different things that we might be interested in. Say here that we want to group our inscriptions based on their letter heights. This is information that can be given there. Oops, sorry. But yeah, just to mention that again. These are all just previews of what is available and how it would look like when you try to annotate document in EpiDoc. You don't need to remember those by heart. They're all in the guidelines, and the guidelines are searchable. So as long as you have a loose understanding of the structure of the EpiDoc template, and as long as you have a good idea of what it is that you want to encode, which is the thing that you need to start with, then this, although it is machine readable, it is very much still kept at the human readable stage, even when all of the detailed annotation elements are added. This is still something that we can open and make sense of. So yes, I am now giving the stage to Clara to talk about vocabularies in Wikidata, which is a super interesting part of today's session, and it's something that she's actually a specialist in. So I'm really excited to hear about it.
Thank you, Polina. So I'm now going to talk about how we actually define inscriptions and how we talk about them, so the vocabularies. Because in order to discuss inscriptions among ourselves, we need first to be able to identify them clearly and to refer to their features in consistent ways. And this is not just because this is not only a matter of standardization for its own sake. What really matters here is that the data must be unambiguous, and if it is to be understood by everybody, of course, and it must be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So fair, as some of us may have encountered this name before. So now, suppose we already know the name of a famous inscription. In that case, it's very easy. We can simply browse it and immediately see what comes up. But of course, the most common situation is where we don't have much information about an inscription. We have seen and we want to look for it. We want to look for that inscription. Or perhaps we're trying to find many inscriptions belonging to certain collections and so forth. And in those cases, epigraphic databases become the most efficient tools we have. They collect inscriptions from across the Greco-Roman world. In this case, the one I displayed here collect inscriptions from the Greek and Roman world, but there are also many other databases beyond the one I have listed here that collect inscriptions from other cultures, other civilizations, and other historical periods. And some of them are, as you can see, like EDB, EDR, and EDH. Some of them are part of a larger ecosystem, and other focus on specific aspects of epigraphy. We might have databases dedicated to Attic inscriptions, or to Roman Britain, or even to metrical inscription form across the world. And generally speaking, the interfaces are quite easy to use. Whenever possible, users are also helped by guides and documentation provided directly on the website. You can search for them in the website. Then, so keeping these resources in mind, I'll now show you three of the main standards used for epigraphic vocabularies. The first is EAGLE, which is probably the most widely used. Then we have EpiVoc, and finally, a more recent initiative called FAIR vocabularies, which is, as the name suggests, closely related to the FAIR approach to data that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Now, sometimes these three vocabularies describe the same concept in slightly different ways, but in fortunate cases, like I'm going to show you, I think you can see my screen here. In some cases, like the one I'm showing here, this is EAGLE, then I'm going to show you EpiVoc, and as well, FAIR vocabulary. So these are three fortunate cases, as I say, where there's actually a perfect match between the three systems. So here we have elogium in FAIR vocabulary, we have eloge, and then a brief description like text formulaire, and then elogium in EAGLE as well. But what usually differs is the description. So And of course, we don't expect the descriptions to be identical, but in generally, in cases like this, they tend to preserve the same underlying meaning, and in this case, the same word as well. In cases where the terms do not coincide, the description, when it's provided, often can help us to disambiguate and understand whether the vocabularies are actually referring to the same thing. Okay. And again, the difficulty is not only that languages change, which is really a major obstacle, of course, as you can tell. It's also that different scholars may use different terms for the same objects, even within the same language. For example, in EDR, a cylindrical object might be called a chipus, but that does not necessarily mean that the same object is described in the same way by the epigraphers working on the FAIR epigraphy project and so on. Then, from this example I'm showing here, you can get an idea of the difference of the terminology between describing an item as an artifact or as a text, as I explained at the start of the session. In this case, we have sepulcralis, and this term describes the type of text we have, namely funerary, while stele indicates the type of object that bears text, but some simply and generally call it gravestone. So again, agreement becomes essential. And the reason for this is very clear when a user searches in a database. If you don't find a word you're looking for, it may simply be because that word is not part of the vocabulary used by that database. And in that case, you have to adapt your search accordingly. Now, in many of these of the initiatives I mentioned earlier, the user is essentially on the other side of the system, reading records, sometimes proposing changes, and if authorized, editing them. But a more recent initiative built on a platform you already encountered turns this system somewhat upside down. It makes information immediately accessible, usable, multilingual, and interdisciplinary, and very flexible in the way it can be queried. And that is Wikidata, a project, as you know, of the Wikimedia ecosystem, just like Wikipedia, of which it actually serves as the underlying database. Only recently have we started opening the doors to Wikidata of Wikidata to epigraphy, including among other digital humanities projects that have already found their place within the database. And the potential for vocabularies here is quite clear, and I'll explain why. So first of all, keep in mind that in Wikidata, every item has both a machine-readable identifier and a human-readable lab. And users can also discuss in real time how concepts should be named and how they relate to one another. So for example, we can ask, can a certain edition, a certain inscription be considered an instance of a funerary inscription, and so on. But we should also keep in mind that Wikidata wasn't created as a humanities database, let alone an epigraphic one. So what we are currently doing is adopting epigraphic terminologies from outside the Wikimedia environment and integrating them into Wikidata, sometimes adapting them in the process because similar concept might already exist, but we don't want to delete it. But rather shape it so that it can bear the same meaning we want to give. An example of this operation is here in the table you can see. A concept is a concept expressed in one vocabulary can be connected to another expressed in differently elsewhere. So, but also remember that, and here. I can also show you this. That's an example of a type of inscription. You have to remember that in Wikidata these connections are represented using RDF. If you remember the same format we use for the GERF exercise some weeks ago. In other words, we have properties, items, and values, or if you prefer, a syntax based on a subject, predicate, and object. And here you can see that's our subject, boundary inscription in this case, and here we have the predicate, which is instance of, and then the value, type of inscription. So that's actually a sentence. Boundary inscription is an instance of type of inscription. And yes, the language used is, it can be, as you can see, human readable here, boundary inscription, but you can also be machine readable. So the machine knows how to disambiguate other boundary inscriptions if we have in Wikidata. So this has a unique number, ID number. And now we'll return to this slide. Okay. At this point, might wonder why create a new epigraphic initiative outside the epigraphic environments that already exist. And I'll tell you very briefly, but first, it is important to be clear about one thing. This initiative is not intended to replace previous ones, but rather to complement them. And the advantage that I tried to show you is that we can have a resource that treats the same inscriptions from a much more interdisciplinary perspective because of the discussion I already talked about. That we can have discussions in Wikidata. We can communicate in real time with the geologists or archaeologists who might be working on similar artifacts. At the same time, these initiatives offer a database that can be queried in many different ways beyond the predefined options already offered by traditional user interfaces in other epigraphic databases. And that flexibility is certainly a major advantage. And so the two recent Wikidata initiatives I want to mention are first Altinum, which I started for my master thesis on description from the Roman Municipium of Altinum, and the IDEA, the huge and large project led by Anshan and her collaborators on the inscriptions of Dura repose. Both projects rely on similar data models, but there are also some important differences between them, and those differences mainly reflect the different research needs we had while collecting and modeling our data. For example, since my corpus did not include graffiti, I did not model that concept in Wikidata, and the IDEA project did because they included graffiti as well. So I would do encourage you to browse these projects and look for the differences, for instance, in the way we name certain inscriptions features, which properties we have, you can see the links here, or which values we connect to the same property. Actually, the good news is that we now have a common ground to work with, namely the fair epigraphy vocabulary that I introduced, which we have decided to adopt as our main reference. And finally, here are two examples that might help you in this process of matching vocabularies, and that's all for me. I'll now turn things over to Gabby, who will introduce and demonstrate this week's exercise.
Oh yes, thank you. That's super interesting. So it's worth just briefly noting that in the slides that we've shared, of the PDF of the slides that you can download, I've included a reference to a quick reference document, which is something that you can download from under the beginning of the description of the exercise, and we've also included the text of the exercise, which we're going to talk about a little bit afterwards. But in brief, the point of the exercise is to find an inscription or more than one. Take the EpiDoc template, which I'm going to show you in a second. Put your inscription in. Start encoding the inscription. Do a bit of encoding of the text. Do in particular, focus on the encoding of the description, the historical information, and the other metadata that Polina showed you. And think while you're doing so about what sorts of entities you might link to disambiguate some of the terms that you're using in there, of the kind that Clara has just been showing you, whether these are to existing vocabularies or to Wikidata items. And then following on from that exercise, think about how would this edition be different if you were encoding it in Wikidata. As an optional extra, if you want to, encode it in Wikidata and find out how different it is. But at the very least, make some notes on how on what things you can do in EpiDoc that you can't in Wikidata, and vice versa. And there will be examples of both things, very clearly. So that's all explained in the exercise. It's both at the bottom of the session page, which again you can find linked in the video description, and in the PDF of the slides, which you should be able to download. So I think if I show my screen, yes, you're seeing my Visual Studio Code interface. I'm just checking that the font is large enough. If I make it a little bit smaller, is that still legible on YouTube? Just about. Do we think? Okay, let's leave it like that for the moment then. So what I've opened here in Visual Studio Code, after installing the plugins that are described again in the exercise, a couple of plugins for XML and TEI in particular, I've then downloaded and opened the EpiDoc template that Polina has already showed you, and that is in the exercise as a link. So this what I'm going to show you now is really just for the benefit of showing you how the Visual Studio Code editor helps you to edit XML. You can edit XML in any text editor. You can edit it in a in a Microsoft Word page or in a text editor or Notepad or whatever. But what it won't give you is the various features that I'm going to show you now. So the first thing you'll notice is that all of the things that Polina's shown you about the object description, these are all part of the TI header, which is this thing here. For my example, I'm just going to show you the text. So I'm going to use this little pointer here in the margin here to collapse or hide the TI header. And I've already hidden the facsimile, and I'm going to go straight down to the text body, which contains the things that are free text as opposed to structured metadata. And these include the edition, the Greek or Latin, or any of the 100 other languages you might be interested in, text. There's apparatus criticus, translation, commentary, bibliography, other things that you might include in there. I'm not going to pay attention to any of those. I'm just going to look at the Greek or Latin text. The template has a description of what it is you will find in these places. So the description that says Greek or Latin, etc. text here, that is not part of the markup. That is just something there to help you know where to put it. So I'm going to delete it. So what we have left now is this element, the div element, which contains all of the things we need for an edition division of our text. There's an anonymous block element and there's a line begins element there. I'm now going to go to an epigraphic edition online, and I'm going to copy some text. This is the Latin text of IRT 1503. It's also known as the Oscar from Bungem number 3. And I'm just going to copy the Latin text from there and paste it into Visual Studio Code. And I'm going to put it right here after the first line beginning inside the division type edition. So there's a few things. That has actually broken one thing, but I'll come to that in a moment. But there's a few things in here that are a little bit odd, and we'll come to in a moment. One thing that I'm going to add before we start is, because this is a Latin text that I've put in, it's quite important to specify the language of a text in XML, because you might want to treat different languages differently. So I'm just going to add this attribute XML lang equals LA. LA is the IANA code for Latin. And if it was ancient Greek, you would say GRC, which is the IANA code for classical Greek. And there's dozens of other codes for whatever other language you might be interested in. Okay, so I'm going to start with the most obvious features of the text, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing because we're already running slightly behind time, and that's largely my fault for talking for too long about text encoding earlier. But the two most obvious things in here, three most obvious things that I'm now seeing in here, are one, that we've got a line beginning, and this is a TEI tag that means this is the beginning of a new line. And so we want one of those at the beginning of every line, and we only have one at the beginning of line 1. So I'm going to highlight that. We could enter a new element each time using the just by typing a square bracket, and then typing L until we get to LB, scrolling down that list and clicking on it, making it an empty element because the line beginning doesn't contain anything. Then adding the N attribute, and then putting in the number 2. And then indenting it so that it looks nice. But actually, having just copied and pasted the first one, I'm just going to be super lazy and paste it at the beginning of every line. And I'm actually going to do the first handful of lines just to save us time. And then I'm just going to update the numbers, which is a lot quicker than entering the line every time. One thing we will notice is that every 5th line was numbered in the web version of this inscription that we looked at earlier, so that 5 is still there that we copied and pasted. That 5 is now represented in the markup, so we don't need it anymore. That's the rule we're going to follow. When we've represented a piece of information in markup, we can now remove it from the text, because it would be redundant. And we would, if I hadn't been so lazy and stopped after 8 lines, we'd also delete this line 10 further down there. The final really obvious thing that I'm going to point out is that there is some red underlining in the middle of this text, which says that we've created an M element in there, which is the element morpheme. But we haven't closed the M element anywhere, which in XML is illegal. The first thing, I'm sure you will all have figured out by now, that we haven't actually got a morpheme element in there, that we're trying to represent some morphemic information in here. What we've actually got is the Leiden convention of using angle brackets to represent an editorial correction in the text. I think it's actually an editorial insertion in this case, in the text. And the angle brackets mean XML tags in XML, so we can't use angle brackets. So this is actually broken XML until we get rid of those angle brackets. But let's not forget that they were there, because that M is text that that is not on the stone, but just saying ad aqua doesn't make sense in Latin. You have to say ad aquam. It's easy enough to omit, because in pronunciation that M is almost silent, possibly entirely silent. I don't know. So the scribe left off I say scribe. This is a very casual text, so it wasn't a scribe. It was just the person scribbling notes on this broken piece of pottery. So this is an example of text that is supplied by the editor. And remember, so I'm pressing Command E to get up the element list. And I'm going to type supplied up there, and I press Enter, and it puts opening supplied before that M and closing supplied after that M. That worked because I pressed Command E while the letter M was highlighted. The supplied element is now underlined in red because we made another mistake. This is not that this is a mistake in the XML or a mistake in TEI even. This is perfectly good XML. It's perfectly good TEI. What it's not is good EpiDoc. Because as I explained earlier, the supplied element, without any attribute disambiguating it, is not enough for EpiDoc, because Leiden has 3 or 4 different kinds of supplement, different kinds of restoration that are completely different. They're considered to be completely different intellectual distinctions. So what we need to do is we need to add this reason attribute And again, I'm just going to press space and then R, and then reason is on there on the list. There's a bunch of values that we can select for this. This is not because the M was lost. It's not that the text has become damaged and the M is no longer there. It's that the M was omitted, that the scribe forgot to write the M because they were writing perfectly good Latin as they understood it, as they pronounced it. But if Cicero had been writing this, he would have included an M in this text. So I've replaced those angle brackets in Leiden with supplied reason omitted in EpiDoc. It's a lot more characters, but it's unambiguous and machine readable now. And so this is the same principle as when I deleted the line numbers, because I've replaced them with the LB tags, and anything else I replace in here, I'm going to take the markup and I'm going to remove the Leiden markup and add XML markup instead. So I'm just going to do two more examples, just very, very quickly. This plus 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 at the end of the line, this means that there are 3 more letters visible on the stone. It's probably not that they're damaged, or it may be that they're worn because this was written in ink on a piece of potsherd. It may be that they were written in such dodgy handwriting that we could never read what they were. But those three illegible letters are a gap, so I type angle bracket G. You see gap is the second example on there. Gap has to have the reason attribute for the same reason that supplied does, and it's given us lost as a suggestion. That's actually a good suggestion, so I'm going to keep it. A gap is an empty element. A gap doesn't contain text, so I'm just going to put that in there. What we do need to say, we need to say, actually, I'm completely wrong. That's it's not lost. That's not good at all. It's illegible. I should have selected that off the list instead. It's not that those letters are no longer there. It's that they're no longer entirely legible. So reason illegible. How many letters? Quantity. There were 3 pluses, so I'm going to assume that means 3 letters. And just to be absolutely clear, unit equals character, because it's 3 characters missing, not 3 lines that were illegible, or 3 anything else that were illegible. 3 characters. So that's a lot longer on the in the XML than just 3 pluses on the screen. I'm going to put it on a new line, partly to make it easier to see, and partly because a new line in the document doesn't mean a new line on the stone, because only this LB n equals 2 means a new line on the stone. I'll do one other thing, and I'm just deciding which other thing to do. Let's just do the very first thing in the text. This XIII on the text. This is not an obscure word or written in all caps. Xi. This is a number. Obviously, this is the Roman numeral 13. So again, I can highlight the number first, press Command E, and then type num, which means numeral. And so we've tagged that as a numeral. That means we could choose to display it, for example, with a line above the text for to disambiguate the fact that it's a number. And we can, if we like, we can give it an attribute value. So I just pressed a space and it gave me that list of attributes. Pressed V and it's given me only the attributes beginning with V, which in this case there's only one. That's value. So I select that. Value doesn't have any offered values because it's not a controlled vocabulary. Put anything in there. It could be a number in the millions, right? But we know that actually is just 13. So we can just type 13 in there. And so we do the same thing following from the quick reference document that you've downloaded. How do you record this abbreviation? How do you record this restoration? How do you record these unclear characters? This abbreviation where the abbreviated part of it is itself unclear. This abbreviation where we haven't transcribed what is on the stone because it's a symbol, not a letter, and all the other things that are on here. This lacuna that we're not attempting to restore, etc. All these various other things on there. You can follow the quick reference sheet to decide how you want to present those things. But I'll stop there because the up to 30 minutes that we're supposed to have for questions has been reduced to 9 minutes. So we can go from there. Does anyone have any, anyone watching, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the live chat to post them, and we can also discuss amongst ourselves in the meantime. I can start with a question if we like. I have a question for Clara. You didn't show us in detail about how to do Wikidata this time, but if people look at either the Altinum or IDEA guidelines that are linked in the exercise, they will see various things that you can encode. And one of the things you can encode is the epigraphic text that uses the property inscription. And you can just put the text in there. And in there, you just put the line of the text. Because we're not putting the full EpiDoc in there, just the line will sometimes be a little bit ambiguous. It'll sometimes be missing information that we would have if we had it in EpiDoc. And that information is information that would be captured in the diplomatic transcription. So my question is there a property we can use in Wikidata alongside inscription to say diplomatic?
So we can, no, actually we can put, if we want, we can put a sort of qualifier with it rather than a new property. But I would suggest not to do that, because we mutually decided that all of the text we put into the records are transcribed in this way.
The interpretative edition.
Yeah, it's sort of, I would say it's sort of implicit that we chose that.
Yeah.
Way. But I do suggest to put rather than the text as you can see it in EDR or in other databases which keep the line outline. I'd suggest to put everything on the same line in Wikidata in the text, because that's right. One of the main differences between the how we encode it, how we transcribe with the system and how we transcribe in Wikidata, because we can't put different lines. There's a limit of characters we can put.
Right. So yeah, that part makes sense. I think, and it may or may not make sense to people watching, because we may have been a bit too telegraphic there, but what a lot of the Eagle databases do when they're presenting the text, and you saw it on the EDR example that Clara showed earlier, although we didn't highlight it, so you may or may not have noticed, but that instead of starting each new line on the stone on a new line on the page, they had a line on the stone followed by a slash, meaning new line. And if there was a new section of the inscription, like it starts on another column or another face, there'd be 2 slashes to represent that break. And that's fairly unambiguous, and it's better suited to database structuring than having line breaks would be, which is why the Ego databases, which are relational databases, use that, and that's why Wikidata, which is a graph database, does the same thing. But you can also do that in diplomatic, of course. You could have the diplomatic with slashes instead of spaces. It's just you would have the text in uppercase. You would have the text as it appears on the stone, rather than as corrected and restored and expanded by the editor and so forth. So I'm interested by your suggestion of using qualifiers. We might therefore say, here's the interpretative transcription, which might be enough. So that would have a qualifier which would say type equals interpretative, something like that. I'm not sure what qualifier it would be.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the property exists, but if it doesn't exist, we can create it.
We can look it up and figure it out, and that's more detail.
We used it actually because it's implicit, but it's useful actually, because right,
when that's the only one you've got, you maybe don't need to specify it. But if you also want to have the diplomatic. For some texts, it's important. You will lose a lot of information if you don't have both. Then you would have the other one. You'd have a qualifier, which would say this one is the diplomatic. How exactly we'd say that in RDF, let's not get into, but we could do that. In some cases, you can only put a diplomatic. The text is so fragmentary, there's no point trying to interpret it, so it's only diplomatic. That might be worth specifying as well, just to explain why it's all in uppercase. So sometimes you'd only want the interpretative, sometimes you'd only want the diplomatic. Sometimes I think you really would want both. Maybe seldom, but sometimes you certainly you would, just because there's so much interpretation and so much emendation has gone on, especially if, for example, you're encoding an inscription that only exists in manuscript form.
Exactly.
The manuscript transcriber may have made all sorts of errors. The stone itself may have also been defective, and you're trying to distinguish those two things from each other. You've got all sorts of complexity in there. Only having one transcription would not be enough. Anyway, yeah, I thought of that when looking at a text. We can maybe talk about that more on another occasion. But cool, qualifiers would be the way to do it. Thank you. That's useful. Any other questions or anything else we want to highlight, suggest? If not, and if no one on YouTube is asking any questions immediately either, I think yes, have a go at the exercise. Enjoy the exercise. EpiDoc's a lot of fun to play with. Wikidata is also a lot of fun to play with. If you want to experiment with that as well, let's have a look at that. Some of you will meet with a tutor or instructor to discuss this next week. Some of you may be looking at this on your own or in several years' time, where there is no instructor handy to look at it anymore. But either way, have fun with it. And if you are here with us in 2026, then please come along next week for the next session, which is on ethics, sustainability, and paradata, which is to say documentation in 3D cultural heritage. And that'll be very, very cool. We've got the two most knowledgeable people in the world on that particular subject have come along there for that. Cool. Thank you all.